Welcome to r/Prorevenge, where OP scams her scamming landlord. Our next Reddit post is from Snooowls. So, I'd been living in this house for almost 5 years, and I gave notice to end the tenancy because I was buying a house. After I'd given notice, the landlord emailed me to ask if I was planning to hire a gardener to ensure the garden would be returned to the pretty manicured state that it was when I moved in. I thought this was strange because my tenancy agreement explicitly forbade me from doing the sorts of things in the garden that would have been necessary to maintain its original state. For example, the agreement said that I wasn't allowed to cut any of the shrubs or bushes. So all I'd been doing is cutting the grass and the hedge. Basically, that clause looked like something a landlord would include if they planned to maintain the garden themselves, except she didn't maintain it while I was living there. In retrospect, it seemed like she didn't read her own tenancy agreement properly. I replied to the landlord's email about the garden. I quoted the part of the tenancy agreement that forbade me from doing certain things in the garden, and expressed my confusion. I asked her to clarify what her expectations were about the state of the garden, given what it said in the tenancy agreement. She didn't reply, but a couple of weeks later, I received an email from her husband or boyfriend telling me that the landlord was anxious about the garden and I should ensure that it's returned to the same state at the start of the tenancy. I replied to him and again asked for clarification given the wording of the tenancy agreement. He replied saying he would have the landlord get back to me herself, which she never did. Without any guidance about the garden, I just did my best with it. My boyfriend, who's an experienced gardener, did the work here. I asked him to just do whatever he thought was best. He cut back bushes and cleared loads of stuff. I spent a few £100 on having garden waste removed. I know that technically I didn't need to do that, but I wanted to do what I could to keep relations good between me and the landlord. I moved out, the tenancy ended, and after not hearing anything from the landlord for a couple of weeks and not having my deposit back, I emailed the landlord to ask about the deposit. Having ignored my queries about the garden before the end of the tenancy, she chose this moment to announce that she wanted to deduct £400 from my deposit to carry out work on the garden. What followed was a really time-wasting back and forth by email in which I pointed out the terms of the tenancy agreement were incompatible with me being able to maintain the original state of the garden. And she just kept repeating to her that the garden was not returned to her in its original state. In the end, I suggested that since we couldn't agree about the deductions from my deposit, we should use the independent dispute process offered by the company that was holding the deposit. That process needs to be kicked off by the landlord, so I asked her to authorize it. She didn't do that. Instead, she kept wasting my time by sending me emails trying to negotiate an amount to put the garden right, which I was not going to entertain. Meanwhile, I couldn't log into the account where my deposit was being held. I contacted the company, and it turned out my landlord had accidentally input my email address incorrectly when registering the deposit, which I found very strange because she had emailed me successfully dozens of times throughout the time that I was living in that house. So she definitely knew my email address. Without being able to log in, I was unable to officially dispute any deductions that she was proposing. There's a 3-month window after the end of the tenancy when you can dispute any deductions. After that, you either take what the landlord is willing to return or go to court. Apparently, it's relatively common for unscrupulous landlords to register their tenants' details incorrectly in an attempt to make it harder for them to recover their deposits in the time frame available for disputes. I had a long back and forth with the deposit company, after which I finally gained access to my deposit account. When I got into it, I looked at the info and noticed that the landlord had not protected my deposit until the day after I gave her notice to end the tenancy. That meant that she protected my deposit well after the 30-day deadline by which she was supposed to do by law. There are penalties for landlords who fail to comply with the laws around tenancy deposits. If they break the rules and the tenant takes them to court, they have to return the full deposit, plus between 1 and 3 times the amount of the deposit as compensation. Also, they're not allowed to make any deductions from a tenant's deposit if they haven't complied with the law. I emailed the landlady a bit more firmly than I had previously. Things had been cordial, but increasingly frosty. I pointed out that she could not make any deductions from my deposit because she hadn't complied with the law. She responded by sending me quite a tantrumy, insulting email and authorizing the return of my full deposit. So, yay for the deposit back. But what a B-word insulting me when I hadn't done anything wrong. I was pissed off by the fact that she had tried to rip me off and wasted hours and hours of my time trying to sort this out. Not to mention the stress. Just seeing an email from her land in my inbox caused my stomach to flip by this point. This is when things started to get a bit more exciting. I had already had my deposit back, but it was clear that if I took her to court, I would receive a minimum of that amount again. Except, of course, I didn't have just one tenancy agreement with her. She had insisted on me signing a new tenancy agreement every year. So I had 5 tenancy agreements with her. I spent a few hours checking the law and going through old emails and documentation, and it turns out she had failed to protect my deposit correctly in all of the 5 tenancies I had with her. I had a ton of documentation to prove that. This meant that if I took her to court, I stood to receive a minimum of not 1, but 5 times the amount of my original deposit, so over £6,500. It would cost me a couple of £100 to take her to court, and I was 100% willing to do that. In fact, at this point, I was relishing that prospect. I had a barrister friend who was helping me out at this point with advice for free. The landlord replied to my letter quite dismissively, basically saying that it was clearly just an admin error that had caused her to fail to protect my deposit correctly every year for 5 years. Lol. And accusing me of being motivated by a windfall. I replied by email, correcting her various mistaken assumptions and repeating the need for her to make an offer in order to avoid court. After a while, she replied and offered me £4,000. I told her the minimum I would accept was a little over £6,500, since that was the minimum I would stand to get in court. She agreed with certain conditions attached, which I was able to comply with immediately. When the money landed in my bank account, I emailed her to explain that I would have dropped my complaint against her immediately had she at any point offered a sincere apology. I also said I hoped she would deal more fairly and reasonably with future tenants. She didn't reply. Our next Reddit post is from Echo. When I was a kid, my father was my best friend. He worked multiple jobs to support my family, all while powering his way through law school. He even built a couple of small businesses from the ground up with a couple of his friends. All while doing this, he managed to be the best dad ever, spending as much time as he could with my mother, myself, and my baby siblings. One day, we found out that he had stage 4 stomach cancer, the kind that you don't recover from. My mother and I stayed by his side all the way till it was all over. The last memory I have of my father was when he was completely immobile, practically a vegetable at this point, with tubes going in and out of his body and me just praying that he'd still be able to remember who I was. All the guy could do was smile at me just to let me know he still recognized his son, even if the doctors told us most of his memories would be gone. Eventually, he fell into a coma for some days before waking up to say goodbye to my mother, who was by his side when he died. She was a housewife, so we really didn't have much to go on after his death. Enter my grandfather. He was one of those self-centered boomer types who makes everything about himself. After my father died, he'd use the newspaper obituary to boast about his dead son's grades and achievements, which I realized seemed to be the only thing my dad was to him. Just in case you were wondering, yes, we're Asian. My mother was grieving and trying to find a way to make ends meet, and my grandfather graciously offered to help her control my father's 2 businesses to help support us. My mother agreed because she didn't have any experience. While we grew up, the 2 businesses didn't provide much for us, likely because my father was one of the big reasons they were thriving. Mom was in and out of multiple jobs just to keep us floating. My grandfather offered to help put me and my siblings through school. I managed to score some scholarships with some good schools growing up, so thankfully he didn't have to do as much for me, but we were really glad that he helped out with my siblings. After I made it out of school, I found out that my family was broke and my 2 siblings were still making their way through medical school. My sister even offered to stop and just get a job, but I told her to keep going because she was doing so well and that she deserved to graduate. My grandparents had cut us off because they didn't approve of the directions my siblings took in life, especially my sister, who was, for them, too female to have a career in medicine. My grandmother's a bit of a misogynist. Why are you wasting your time and money becoming a doctor? You're just gonna have children and quit. I was working as a high school teacher when I was contacted by one of my dad's old business partners for one of his companies. After I asked him about how the company was doing, he told me that my grandfather, who was still in control of my father's shares, was siphoning money from the company for himself, and he was earning way more than he was giving me and my siblings for our education. So all our lives, my grandfather had been making us feel indebted to him for money that was supposed to be ours to begin with. And he lied to us by telling us that Dad's companies weren't making any money for us at all. We also realized that when he cut us off, he was cutting us off from our own money, forcing my siblings to drop out and give up careers that they'd worked their whole lives for. What worse is that this was our father's money, and we know that he'd wanted it to help us provide for our futures, even after he died. And here comes his butthole father basically dumping on his legacy for his own enrichment. I even found out that my grandfather used his position to take possession of the company's office space and forced them to set up shop in a smaller, cheaper office, while renting the original space out under his own name to the company's competitors to make money from them too. All while I had to work multiple jobs to help my mother and siblings pay the bills. Cue revenge. My grandfather's biggest weakness has always been his pride. In fact, I suspect that he wanted us to think that he was helping us out of his own pocket because he wanted everyone to think he was some kind of hero, when in reality, he was financially choking us. I recognize that no matter what my grandfather said, my siblings, my mother, and I were legally the owners of my father's company shares. So after having a statement signed by the three of them, I approached all the board of directors, sans my grandfather, and let them know that I was now the sole representative of my late dad's estate. My grandfather had also made himself chairman of the board. So I convinced them that since he was only chairman as representative of my father's estate, that made me the chairman. Then I contacted other members of my extended family about my grandfather's unethical practices with the company's office space. He was eventually pressured by them into evicting the company's main competitor from their office space. Serves them right for conniving with my grandfather to take the company's old office space. At the next board meeting, I prepared for the moment I'd been waiting my entire life for. When my grandfather entered the conference room to preside over the meeting as the chairman, he found his chair facing away from the table with all the board members already seated at the table. And like a Bond villain, I spun my chair around to reveal to him that I'd been the one sitting there the entire meeting. I told him that the company and my family no longer needed him, and that I'd be taking control over representation of my father's estate. "Don't you know that I'm the one that put him and his siblings through school?" my grandfather said in shock. I only went, "No, Dad did." The look of sheer embarrassment on his face was perfect. I've never seen him look defeated my entire life until that moment, and this sort of satisfaction couldn't be achieved by simply ratting him out. I stepped down from the chairman position and took a job in the company's treasury department as a bookkeeper with a meager salary. But at least now, any profit sharing or dividends that the company released would go where my father wanted them to go. And finally, one of the first decisions I got to make as a board member before stepping down was to give my mother a permanent job that she deserved. My grandfather is now jobless. He spends all of his time at home, and because he spent his life being selfish and self-centered, he has no friends. All he has going for him was being able to power trip over other people and boasting about his assets and achievements. Even my grandmother has had it with him, and the two don't even sleep in the same room anymore. I hope he lives the rest of his short life regretting that he didn't live his life with more compassion and humility. Then OP posted an update. Apparently, my sister saw this post and just informed me that my grandfather's kinda miserable now because he siphoned what's left of their money to an extramarital sugar baby that he had in probably another attempt to get someone to affirm and glorify him. I guess he hasn't learned. Also, down in the comments, OP clarifies that the grandfather still sees himself as the family hero, so he sounds like a run-of-the-mill narcissist. Our next Reddit post is from Eric Smith. I got revenge on a douchebag that I used to volunteer firefight with. This was in the early to mid-2000s. I decided to go to the local fire department as a volunteer firefighter. I did it for about 5 years, and it was great. Training consisted of 3 months of firefighting training, and then you'd get your EMT training. After about a year, I was asked to help train some new recruits. One of the lieutenants, Amy, was a short, middle-aged woman who was so full of fire she could make a grown man cry. She was one of those people who commands both fear and respect wherever she went. Honestly, a great lieutenant and a great person. When she wasn't being a drill sergeant, she was extremely kind and generous. She would often bake people cakes and treats and deliver them to various stations in our department. However, in this new academy class that I was asked to help with, there was a cocky kid we'll call Aaron. Aaron talked big during the training and acted like he was an all-American hero. Like he was going to be the lead badass in Backdraft 2. He performed moderately well in training, but far from the top of our class. He got assigned to Amy's station, which is a pretty quiet station in the department. A few months after he starts, Amy swings by my station one night to say hi. She brings us the motherlode cake from a nearby restaurant. She explained that she treated her crew to a night out at that restaurant, which must have cost a lot of money. I think she took about 8 people and bought a whole cake to top it all off. They had eaten the top 2 layers of a 6-layer cake, so she gave us the remaining 4 layers. We thanked her profusely and she left. Back then, the big social media platform was MySpace, and I decided to look up some of the people in the department to make friends. I came across Aaron's page, and I noticed some photos of him and the rest of his crew at the restaurant with Amy. However, when I read the comments, Aaron bragged about how he had purposefully ordered the most expensive dinner, appetizers, and drinks since Amy was buying. He bragged about how he was going to take advantage of her stupidity. This alone pissed me off because she was doing this super nice and generous thing. What an ungrateful, selfish dick. Then I read the rest of his profile. He had videos and memes on his page glorifying himself as a badass firefighter, bragging about running into burning buildings and how he was such a hero. He was flirting with girls, blatantly trying to impress them with how brave he is. Bear in mind, he just graduated from the academy 3 months prior and hadn't even gone to EMT school. He had never been to a house fire, and all he basically did was carry gear for the other fully qualified firefighters. It was too much for me to tolerate. So here's the revenge. I printed off copies of his MySpace page, including his comments about Amy and his toxic bragging. I made multiple copies and took them to every station in the department. We all had pagers. God, I'm old. And a small keyboard at each station to send out text messages. I made an anonymous, all-staff page to everyone in the department. I had to keep it brief since I couldn't fit a ton of characters, but I sent out his MySpace info and told everyone about how he treated Amy. Within an hour, Aaron had cleared out his MySpace page of all of his posts, photos, etc. A couple of days later, he deleted his account. It's a good thing I made so many copies. Immediately after this happened, he stopped coming to volunteer, and a few weeks later, I heard that he had quit. I later talked to Amy and admitted that I was the one who sent the page. I told her I hated how he treated her, and she thanked me. She seemed really sad and hurt by what Aaron had done. But being the tough, short lady that she was, she quickly got back into being an actual badass firefighter. She later started dating and married a fire chief that also helped at the academy. I've lost touch with her, but I hope she did well. She seemed pretty happy last time I saw her. That was rSlash_Prorevenge, and if you like this content, check out my podcast where I publish the exact same episodes. Also, hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.